Hello there, Loving Without Boundaries community. I am super excited to be here with Leah Marshall. We have an amazing interview coming up today that we called Poly Perspectives. So Leah, I just want to say welcome and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us and share your experiences with our amazing community.
Thank you so much, Kitty. Yeah, I joined, I think this past weekend, and the dialogues have been super interesting, as well as the comments and the advice. So I'm just so excited to be here and to connect with your community and to share my experiences as well.
Thank you so much for being here. And it looks like I think we have one viewer so far. If you can see and hear us okay, just let us know in the comments. We'd really appreciate just to make sure that all the tech is working as it should be. So, but Leah, yeah, so you and I met, thankfully, through your Esther Perel discussion group, which is amazing. And we've interviewed each other, and you'll be coming, I'll be releasing a podcast soon with Loving Without Boundaries, so the community will get to enjoy that as well.
Wonderful.
I'm really excited to dive into our topic today. I know you have some amazing things to share. So why don't would you like to just share a little bit about yourself before we dive in?
Yeah, I would love to actually just share the impetus for this conversation. So I identify as solo poly, which means that I prefer not to have a primary partner, but still just really, really value emotional connection and physical intimacy and connection and conversation. And so that's kind of my poly why. And so generally, I'm entering into an existing couples dynamic. And while I'm relatively new to this, at least with the label of polyamory, I think I've kind of been practicing it unknowingly for about the past decade. I've had some really profound experiences. And I feel like, when I think about my passion and my purpose, you mentioned that I founded and lead this relationship group on Facebook, inspired by the work of Esther Perel, who's probably like the most preeminent therapist of our time. My passion and my purpose is to help people have deeper, richer, more meaningful relationships. And so if I can use my experiences to inspire other people on this journey, to me, that's my passion and my purpose. So that's kind of my why for being here today. Just to share some of the things I've experienced so that people can have a fuller perspective of what it might feel like to be the third person entering an existing couples dynamic that's opening up or is already open.
That is so beautiful. And you have such a generous heart and just a beautiful soul. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the past few weeks. I guess it's really been for us. So I love your why. I love that desire to help the community. So speaking for our community, which is over, I think it's 5,400 strong right now, which is amazing. I just want to say a big thanks for your desire to share your experiences and help pave the way for other people. Because I just find there are, particularly this year, I feel like there are a lot of people who are exploring opening up, and they are having some pain points and some struggles. So it's so beautiful and generous of you to share your experiences. So thank you again before we even get started for everything that you're doing. So I see we have some more viewers. So if you're watching this now, yes, thanks for being here. But if you're watching this now, just type in the comment box if you can hear us and see us okay, just to make sure. And we'll keep, Leah and I'll keep moving forward. But I just want to make sure we got a thumbs up on our tech here. So I'd love to start asking some questions if that's okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to preface with 2 notes.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
This is just one perspective. Obviously, there's so many different types of like whys for coming to polyamory. I was having a bit of a chuckle because I was talking with a friend the other day who's polyamorous, and she mentioned that she was in about a 4-year poly relationship that ended, and it was like super painful, and she's been not dating for about the past 18 months, I think she said, and now she's ready to step back in. And she actually said that she's really drawn to a couple that has a lot of restrictive rules because it actually feels safer to her. Whereas I'm someone where I experience a lot of restrictive rules and it's pretty painful for me. So I wanted to preface that I'm simply sharing from one perspective that might not be voiced frequently. Especially I noticed in a lot of like the books that people usually read when starting poly, it's really kind of written from the perspective of the couple opening up without sharing a lot of diverse perspectives of other partners that would enter into the dynamic. So wanted to share that. And then also, I'm seeing some of the comments come through, which is wonderful. If you guys have any specific questions for me, I'm so open to answering them as best I can. So feel free to throw any questions either that you have now or that come up during our conversation in the comments.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you so much for that disclaimer. And I 100% agree. I mean, there are so many stars in the sky. And what I like to say is there are as many ways to practice consensual non-monogamy or polyamory or however you identify as there are stars in the sky. So I appreciate that disclaimer. And I'll mostly be letting you answer from your perspective. But if I feel I can add anything, I'll, of course, add that as well. So the first question I have is a little bit in regards to opening up. So what would you say, Leah, are some well-intentioned steps many couples take when they're opening up that can be unintentionally hurtful to a new person entering their dynamic? I'd love to hear your answer to that.
Yeah. So in the experiences that I've had so far, what I've noticed is, again, at least in the couples I've dated, there's kind of this tendency to, at all costs, protect the existing couple and their existing dynamic. And I think it's just important to note that whenever you're opening up, it's going to be death to the previous relationship. Not death to the relationship, but to the previous dynamic that you had. Adding a new person to a family, whether it's, a new child or if you're adopting or whatever it might be, it's just going to inherently change it. That's how human beings are, with our rich feelings and needs. And there's this amazing example. I don't know if you guys listen to the podcast Poly Weekly. It's one that I really enjoy. And the host shared this great example that kind of forever changed how I think about open relationships. And she talked about new parents. She said, oftentimes when you get the news, let's say you're a couple and you get the news that you're pregnant, the first reaction might be a little bit of like, oh my gosh, am I ready for this? Like fear and anxiety. But it's pretty rare that a couple would place rules on this new human being. Like if they get too needy, we're gonna cut and run. Or, if they start like really kind of encroaching on our date nights, this probably isn't gonna be for us. If things get too intense, we're gonna kick the kid out. So like that sounds really cruel, right? And yet, veto power is really a thing in relationships. And so my suggestion is like, if you're not ready for the death of the previous relationship, you might not be ready for a polyamorous relationship. You might be open for swinging, where there tends to be kind of this compartmentalization of emotions in one specific geographic space or during like a time-bound experience, and then, the close to that. But for me, polyamory is really about, deep intimacy and emotional connection, and obviously physical connection as well. And so I think the first step is really being comfortable with the death of the previous dynamic.
That is such a great answer. And I hadn't heard that analogy before. Did you say it was Cunning Minx who shared that?
Yeah, it's episode 330.
I love that you know the episode number. So episode 330, that's great. I love that analogy. That is a great analogy, because sometimes I've had some trouble trying to figure out how to explain how veto power can feel kind of abusive or controlling, or not taking that third person's feelings into account. And that's a great analogy to use to help people understand that very easily. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And there was one other, in some of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of, probably the most commonly shared article. It's called couple disentanglement, the most skipped step when opening a relationship. And it's funny because I definitely have a very strong independent side. So I don't think this would necessarily apply to me. But there are some couples that really, once they come together and are exclusive, they're kind of the core person in their lives. Like they really do everything together. And so this article talks about the process before opening up of disentanglement. And so what that might look like is planning time that's separate from each other throughout the week. And communicating those plans to the other person. It might be developing new friendships outside of that person if they've kind of been your one and only. Oftentimes, what can be the most jarring part of an open relationship is that disentanglement. So it's not the new person. It's more just the process of like not spending all of your time together, not kind of just like assuming that your plans are going to be together, that dinner's going to be together, etc. And I can link that up once you post the interview.
That would be great.
Great article.
100%. Yeah, it sounds like a great article, and I see that a lot when I'm working with people. Is I have to teach sometimes what codependency is, and it sounds like what you're describing is when people may be codependent and don't really realize it. And so if you are going to open up your relationship, it makes a lot of sense the way you're describing it. So I'm excited to read that article as well.
Yeah. And I'm such a relationship junkie. So I love like talking about codependency and enmeshment. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, codependency would be like taking on someone else's emotions as your own, or when they're sitting with suffering, making it your responsibility to fix them.
Yeah, that's definitely a great way to describe it. Another way I would stack on that also is when a relationship is starting to be unhealthy or isn't working for one or both of the people, and it's starting to be toxic, and neither person is willing to leave the relationship. Stay in it no matter if it's healthy or not. That's another way that I describe that. So, but I love both of those definitions very much. So I would, I'd love to talk about unicorn hunting. So, and if you could explain what that is, for people, but have you ever been unicorn hunted, Leah?
So it was funny. I was actually it wasn't a Zoom call. It was a Google Meet, which I guess is like the new trendy thing. And it was hosted by, have you ever heard of the Probably Poly podcast?
I have heard of that one.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. So one of the hosts he's an ethics like researcher and practitioner. And so he brings kind of that perspective to the conversation. And we were having a conversation about like what constitutes unicorn hunting. So some of the things that came up were the one penis policy, anytime that another human being is kind of used for relationship aid. So their purpose is to try to fix something within the existing couple, or if there's an element of objectification. So either like not treating the third person as if they have like feelings and needs, and anytime they have feelings and needs, kind of cutting things off. So those were some of the elements that came up. I'd be curious to hear from some of the listeners what elements you would put as part of it. But yeah, actually my first experience with poly and kind of what got me into it was being unicorn hunted. And I had no idea that it was happening. I was so clueless to it until after the fact. So essentially what happened is I had connected with a guy on a dating app, and his first picture was just him. And I'm much more into like energy and words than visuals. So sometimes like I won't even look at all the pictures. I'll like read the profile, and that will be like what determines it for me if I'm interested. And he had listed badminton and tennis in his profile. And I played badminton all 4 years of high school. Like it was a really big part of my high school experience. And I absolutely love tennis. And because of COVID, I haven't really been able to play with my normal tennis partner. So I got super excited and I swiped and we matched. And after we matched, I looked at his full profile and I noticed that the rest of the pictures were a woman. And so, I mean, really the first thing I communicated to him is like, I'm so sorry. I think this was an accident. Like, I'm really heterosexual, not interested in threesomes. And basically he's like, you seem super cool. Why don't we all meet up like on a nice day? We'll have a picnic, you know, worst case scenario, we'll get a new tennis partner.
Yeah.
And so I ended up meeting up with them and like actually had a really great time. I did think it was a little, I'm like, is this a date? Like there are three of us here. He's like, it's a date. So, so we had this kind of nice experience. We were like playing long games. And then right after they wanted to meet up again, the three of them. And meanwhile, I'm like really reiterating, like, you know, the female partner is like, she's super attractive. I'm just not interested in women. He's like, it's okay. Like, we'll brainstorm some ideas of what's possible. And then meanwhile, the guy and I, we kind of have similar like communication styles and needs. Like we both super enjoy texting. We love like really exploring each other's inner worlds, creating emotional intimacy that then led into like sexting. So we're developing all of this energy. So by the time we get to our second date, we'd probably been doing that for about like 3 or 4 weeks daily. And there was a lot of like sexual tension that had been building up. And at the end of the second date, his partner said, I'd be fine with you guys going on a solo date. And we end up then going out the following week and just like have the most magical time. And we ended up spending probably about like 5 hours together and also sharing an act of physical intimacy together. And, you know, the next day, like he and I were chatting about the night and how great it was and like when we'd see each other again and what we'd do. And then like hours later, he's like, actually my partner was really triggered by, by us connecting. And apparently he had like showed her some of our sexting, which I definitely didn't consent to. And he told her about intimacy, which I definitely didn't consent to. And, you know, shared some of our texting as well. And that was kind of like the veto power. It just kind of ended after that. He had said, listen, she's asking for 2 weeks with no contact for us to sort this out. And I said, like, listen, when I'm experiencing conflict, like communication is super important to me. And I think he like heard that. And I don't know if it was because she said, you absolutely can't talk to this person, or if he wasn't sure if he could, like, you know, kind of, again, disentanglement, creating your own boundaries that are separate from your partner's. Bottom line, didn't talk for 2 weeks. He came back to me and said, listen, we're not really on the same page about non-monogamy. And then things were cut off.
Wow.
And so what was funny is I was so kind of confused as to what was going on, because traditionally unicorn hunting it's very clear that the woman is bisexual and everyone's going to play together. And this had a little bit of a twist on that because I'm not bisexual. So I ended up emailing a couple people who have like public platforms. And the consensus coming back is like, yep, you've been unicorn hunted. And they kind of like explained to me what that is. And yeah, it's a very dehumanizing experience, because I felt really treated like a prop or like a sex toy even for their existing relationship. And as soon as something felt like threatening or triggering or uncomfortable, I was kind of like shut out and then just dropped.
Yeah. To me, it's just, it's really hurtful, you know, because your feelings weren't considered. That to me, there was a lack of respect that was going on. I've been in a somewhat, not as exactly like that, but I know what you're describing. I've been in something similar. And the way I described it is, I felt like I was a doll that could be put on a shelf and just kind of turned off. And then when they wanted me, they would take me off the shelf and then invite me back in. I'm like, hey, but I'm actually a human being with feelings and schedules and other people in my life, you know? Yeah. So, I thank you for the vulnerable sharing there. I'm sure that resonated with a lot of people from each side of the fence too, because I think it's important to understand how each person is reacting or how that experience is showing up. So thank you for sharing that.
And I just want to add, like, I'm a deeply like emotional feeling person. I enter into relationships to feel deeply. I know that some people are different and they actually like prefer not to feel super deeply in their romantic relationships or even their sexual experiences. And so I do think that there's a place for this. I think it probably falls a little bit more under like swinging than polyamory. But I would just say, like, let's say you're a couple that wants to bring in, a sexy woman to have sexy sexual experiences with. I would just say, like, be fully upfront and disclose what you're looking for and how you're going to respond. Say like, listen, we want to try this thing. We're really new to it. We're not sure if it's for us. So like, we're going to try it, once and then like maybe reassess. And that might mean that we cut off the connection. Are you comfortable with that? Just like fully disclose and show up with integrity.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree, because it's like you said earlier, it's really all about consent. So there are definitely people out there who want to be a sex toy, right? Like, use me, enjoy my body, right? But it's all about having that conversation instead of feeling like you just got hoodwinked, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or you weren't actually part of the conversation, right?
100%.
Yeah, I think anything that's consensual among adults is great, but it's about everyone being treated equally and with respect. So yeah, I love that. So my next question, when we think about rules, so how do you respond to a couple that approaches you with a list of their rules?
Yeah. So I have so many thoughts about rules. The first is, I think it's really important to differentiate and define things that are often conflated. So like rules, agreements, and boundaries. Mm-hmm. So rules are essentially controlling someone else's behavior. So a common rule might be like, you're not allowed to have another partner sleep over and have sex in our house, controlling their behavior. A boundary defines the limits of your own. So, if I find out that there's someone else having sex and sleeping in our bed, I'm not going to feel comfortable sleeping in that bed, and I'm going to find somewhere else in the house to sleep. That's like kind of extreme, but just to give you a sense, like with a boundary, there's always like an internal locus of control. Mm-hmm. An agreement is essentially like it's made between partners. For example, we're going to tell each other if we're speaking to or seeing a new partner. So it's kind of like, I don't know, like a guideline for the relationship. I think agreements are great. To me, they show healthy communication. And I think boundaries are, whether you're talking poly relationships or monogamous, like boundaries are like what makes relationships enriching and nourishing or like toxic. To me, they like let in the good and they keep out the bad. They're like a filter in that way for yourself. In my experiences, have had some rules imposed on me. And again, like on the theme of dehumanizing, anytime someone else is like putting rules on you that impact your sexual pleasure, your sexual experiences, your autonomy, or even your privacy, it can be really objectifying. Mm-hmm. There's a woman who has a YouTube channel that I adore. I think she's stopped creating content, but her name is Jay Koyanagi. Have you heard of her?
I have not. No, I'm fascinated.
She's so great. And I think of all of the rules, podcasts, and videos I've seen, hers is my favorite. Mm-hmm. So I want to share some highlights from this video in case it's helpful. Absolutely. The first thing she talks about is you can't control someone into being a good partner with rules. Like no amount of rules will make someone thoughtful and caring or protect you from relationship pain. Mm. And she talks about how she personally feels a lot safer in a relationship when someone shows care towards her and her feelings and her needs because they want to, not because a rule told them they need to. Like if you have a rule, like you have to be home, if you're out with another partner, you need to be home by midnight, and then the person's home by midnight. It's kind of like, well, I don't know if they're home because they want to have sex with me or spend the rest of the evening with me, or if it's because I told them they need to. So I think that that's an important point. Another important point to think about is creating a rule the best way to achieve your goal? So if the goal is to have like stronger, richer, more meaningful, more safe relationships, like is a rule really the best way to get you there? I think it can often be like the default way. And I think it's important to examine, is it really the best way? To me, having a rule communicates like, I actually don't trust you to show care towards my needs and to show up for me on your own. And a rule also has to have consequences. So, I don't know what that would be. Like if you take on another partner without my consent, then I'm going to do X, and do you really want to follow through with that consequence? And does someone being in trouble because they broke a rule, really serve the higher goal of having safer, more meaningful, more rich relationships? I thought that was another great point to think about. And could the original intention of having safer, richer, more meaningful relationships just be achieved through communication? Is another thought. I think oftentimes the vulnerable, exposed, challenging conversations are actually what strengthen the relationship and create greater intimacy. And isn't it funny how our tendency is to avoid those moments, whereas really if our goal is that deeper, more connected relationship, that's actually the pathway to getting there.
Yeah.
So those are some nuggets for noodling on. And then what's interesting is there's this phenomenon called reactance. There was a Multiamory podcast episode on cognitive biases in relationships. And it was super dorky and I loved it. And they talked about this phenomenon of reactance, which is anytime we have our personal freedom limited in some way by a rule or another person, we have kind of this subconscious response to do anything in our power to get that personal freedom back. Even if it's not something that's really, really important to us, it's the act of having our personal freedom curtailed that can lead to that response. And so the example would be let's say there's a specific sexual act that's not super meaningful for you, but there's a rule that's put on you where you can't have that sexual act. On a subconscious level, you're going to want to have that act just because that power was taken away from you. That's called the phenomenon of reactance. And there's this great quote, "There's no such thing as offense that people don't want to see the other side of," which is kind of the same idea. So thinking about what if placing rules actually has the opposite effect, both for your partner as well as the partner that they're involved with, is something else to kind of noodle on about rules. And then finally, there's this idea of invoking monogamy and what would monogamists do? The prospect of a random stranger determining what you can and can't do sexually or experience pleasure-wise with your body would be super weird. And yet oftentimes that can happen in polyamory, where there are rules placed on a third person by someone who's essentially a stranger to them that really determine their pleasure and their sexual experiences and how deeply they can feel and love. And then thinking about what if the tables were turned and the third person got to place rules on what the couple could experience? That would be so odd to us, right?
Right.
So and then I just wanted to close with, on the topic of rules, I think that rules that only impact the couple, if they want to make rules that allow them to feel safe, great. Anytime there are rules that affect the third person should really be at the table for that conversation.
Yeah, I love everything that you shared there. Really powerful and insightful things. So just some things I'd love to highlight. I definitely am 100% with you on the concept and the difference between rules and boundaries and agreements. And one thing I like to say in terms of keeping things healthy for yourself is the concept that we teach other people how to treat us. So that's something to note in terms of taking a stance of self-responsibility when entering into any situation with anybody, you know, whether it's intimate or not. And I love what you said about communication. And I just want to underscore, I love Brene Brown too. We're talking about so many great teachers that we both love, but I love how Brene Brown talks about being vulnerable with other people, you know, in conversations. Like that's a strength. It's not a weakness. And that's how we can build deeper intimacy and deeper connection, even though we're afraid to do it sometimes, right? Like it takes a little bit of courage, but having those conversations can really deepen those relationships. But I love everything you shared and the lens that you're looking at it through of what it's like to experience as that third person when you are working with or talking to or potentially getting into a relationship with a existing couple. So incredible. Thank you for everything that you're sharing so far. So my next question is centered around permission granting. So have you ever been in a dynamic where each new act of physical intimacy had to be approved by your metamor, which is your partner's partner, for those that aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, it's a really dehumanizing experience. And again, it was one I didn't even realize I was in it until kind of like after the fact. And I'm like, wow, that sucked. So essentially, this was the same couple that I was describing earlier, brand spanking new to opening up. Yeah. And every time this guy and I were chatting about something we wanted to do or a position we wanted to try or whatever it might be, it was like, that sounds amazing. Let me just run it by, you know, my partner. And I think, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. In that moment, I should have absolutely spoken up and said, I actually don't consent to having our conversations, particularly the ones about sexual intimacy, shared with your partner. And you either need to be like physically available to me or this isn't going to be a fit for me, you know? But of course, like it's like so hard in those moments to have that clarity, you know.
100%. You're human, right? You're human.
So I remember kind of like just having such a negative reaction when he shared that. And I think it was a couple things. It felt very parental, like I don't have full control over my body. And, you know, like that feeling of when you're a teenager and you're like asking mom if you could like, you know, whatever, go to this X party. It was kind of like that feeling of like not being the decision maker and waiting for someone else to be that final authority. Which is not like it's not an empowering feeling.
Not at all. Yeah.
And similarly, what's that?
I said it's a great analogy.
So there's kind of this parental aspect to permission granting that feels really crummy. And I just want to share this again, like if there are couples that are new to opening up and they're trying to figure out like, how can we do this in a way that feels like really good and empowering to us? Just want to share the experience of how it felt to be on the receiving end. So similarly, it didn't really feel like I had full autonomy over my body. And I know that, you know, some people are much more drawn to like security and stability. Others are much more drawn to like freedom and autonomy. And I'm for sure on the freedom and autonomy side. So someone who's drawn to security and safety and stability might have zero issues with permission granting. So I would just say, like, if this is something that you need in your relationship to move forward with opening up, just share that like before the first date or on the first date so that the person knows what they're getting into. And then finally, and maybe even most important, is that I didn't have any privacy because everything was being shared for approval. And privacy is something that is super, super important to me in intimacy. And so I realized after the fact, like, wow, like everything is just like out there because there's so much, because there was a lot of fear because it was their first experience. And there was the sense of like, if we just disclose everything, it will be less scary. And then the collateral damage was my privacy.
Yeah.
So, and then I would flip the tables and say, like, if you are someone who really values autonomy and really values privacy, make sure that you proactively are asking questions before the first date about their agreements and how they structure things so that you can also protect yourself against getting into these experiences.
Such a beautiful share again. And I love all the analogies. And one thing I want to highlight there is it's such a dance, I find, between the disclosing and the communication and the transparency compared with privacy and consent to talk about those things. So that's something I've also noodled on my blog and just on relationships is it's a dance and it's a balancing act, but it is another form of negotiation and another form of boundary setting that can also be self-explorative, like coming from a place of self-mastery and understanding what is okay with you and what's not okay with you. Because it's such a dance. So there is like a hard and fast rule, but it's important to have your eyes wide open as you're going into these situations. So again, I love everything that you're sharing.
Yeah. And I would say, like, if there's ever a question, just ask.
Yeah.
And I would also say, like, general disclosure, I'm fine with. You know, if he had said, like, listen, we're sexting and it's like, it's really turning me on and it's opening my eyes to some new things and I'd love to try them with you. Fine.
Yeah.
If he's going into like specifics and details, really not fine. You know? And so if he had said, like, listen, my partner has asked for disclosure as a way to make her feel more safe and comfortable in this process because it's so new to her. Would you be comfortable with me sharing that we've been sexting quite a bit?
Yeah.
I would have for sure consented to that. Like, I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to do anything like under the table. But it's any time you get into, because that's like, you feel like really exposed, you know, it's almost like when someone gets their computer hacked and like nude pictures are like put out there, that's kind of like what it felt like. And we didn't exchange any like videos or pictures of ourselves nude, but it was more just like what we were discussing. And I was like really sharing my inner world and my sense of eroticism. And I never consented to that being shared with anyone but him.
Yeah, because then I can understand what you're saying. It feels frightening because it's like if there, is there a candid camera on me that's disclosing everything that we're talking about, right? Yeah. Like, that you don't know what's actually going to be shared. So intimacy, you don't know if it's like going to be broadcast on some screen, Right. So that I can totally understand that. So love that sharing. So my next question is about, and this is near and dear to my heart too, hierarchy in couples privilege. So is there any element of hierarchy that you enjoy? And also what elements do you find challenging when we are talking about hierarchy and couples privilege?
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, I really value my freedom and autonomy and my time too. I will fully own that I require a lot of personal time to pursue my passions. And so one element of hierarchy that I appreciate is, a lot of people want to have a domestic partner, like they want someone to live with. A lot of people want to have families together. A lot of people want to get married. A lot of people want to entangle their finances. And those are all things that I really have little interest in. And so I remember when I was engaging in the experience I shared about earlier, the two of them all really wanted that stuff. And I felt kind of like this sigh of relief, like, oh, it's so great. Like they want that. I totally don't. And it felt like, wow, this is so like complimentary, So that element, I actually like, I'm drawn to, like, to me, that's one of the aspects of polyamory that's really attractive is that you can have people with different needs and they're complementary. And they don't actually like take away from each other, but like add to each other. So that element I like. The element that becomes problematic is just when I'm not being treated like an equal human being, like with equal care towards my feelings and my experience and my needs. And I think sometimes there's kind of this, there's like couples privileges where just like the fact that you know, in this case, like might have been together for a lot longer than me.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that I shouldn't be treated with the same amount of care. And, you know, care and consideration. So to me, there are benefits. And I know a lot of people who are solo poly like me, like really appreciate that other partners can do the domestic thing and the family thing. Mm-hmm. And we can have what's meaningful for us, which generally is like emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, connection, communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely resonate with that from both sides of the fence. There's a friend of mine who I know, she similar to you, like she prefers to have her own apartment. You know, she's divorced. And so she kind of went down that relationship escalator and doesn't want to do that again. And she does really enjoy her autonomy. And then, you know, in contrast for me, you know, I live with both my partners. I'm legally married to one of them, but I live with both of them. So it's a matter of understanding, like, how do we work out our finances? And again, it's another dance, just trying to understand, but respecting each person's autonomy, respecting each person's needs. And there also can be different agreements made with different partners based on that. But one of the reasons I love polyamory or consensual non-monogamy is kind of that concept that you're talking about how everyone's got their different needs, and in multiple relationships, you can address those with different, you know, partners in your life. And that can be a really beautiful thing. So we can have our cake and eat it too, and as long as it's consensual and talked about. So I really love that.
And I would say there's almost like this trend now of like hierarchy being not cool or like frowned upon.
Yeah.
And so I think like if I were to just ask the question, like, do you have a hierarchical relationship? Some people who do, or there are elements of like couples privilege that are important to them, they might say, oh no, like we don't practice hierarchy. And I think it's super important if you really value your autonomy and freedom and being treated like an equal human being, that you know the types of questions to like follow up with after that. So something like, you know, is there anything that you only do with your primary partner that you wouldn't do with a secondary partner? Or do you have any rules that would dictate my autonomy and my relationship with you? You know, does your spouse have veto power? Does your partner have any input on what we do and how we conduct our relationship? So trying to get like super specific in the areas that are important to you versus just asking like a pretty general question that might have a negative connotation. And so they're going to say that they don't practice it is important.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one thing, as you were talking, I wanted to add, I did a little bit of research a few weeks ago about couples privilege, and I don't remember exactly how they worded it, but I thought this was fascinating. They mentioned that privileges, and in this context, couples privilege, are there whether we are going to, address it or say it out loud or not. So for example, even just using myself as an example, I'm legally married to one partner, and therefore, because the world is constructed the way it is, there are advantages, as the married couple that my husband and I get to enjoy. And so it's just simply a fact. It just is, and some of it you can't change. It's some things are negotiated, but it's important to understand that some privileges are just there, and it's important to be cognizant of it,
Right. Yeah. Right. Like the fact that you live together means like you get to have certain experiences that are just a part of like physically being in the same space. Whereas hierarchy might be more of like a conscious choice.
Right. Exactly.
Versus couples privileges, which are more just like inherently built in to the structure.
Well, and also built into our laws, in terms of the tax benefits and things of that nature, and life insurance and all of those things, And then, of course, the social structures of it being a little easier, if you kind of like in our journey before we came out as polyamorous, we were reluctant at first. And it took me a little while to realize it was me being comfortable with that couple's privilege and wanting to lean into it, because it's easier to be in society if you're kind of pretending you're a monogamous couple. Do you know what I mean? Because, when you come out, then all of a sudden you can get ridiculed. You can get stigmatized because all of a sudden now you're a minority, instead of majority, you know? So some of those things just are, you know? It's important to just acknowledge that. So in terms of another concept that's really interesting is labels. So so people in your position, Leah, who date someone in a primary relationship are often called secondary partners or thirds, and that this kind of goes along the lines of following on to the hierarchy. How do labels like that feel to you? I'd be really curious to hear that.
Yeah. And again, everyone is so different in this sense. I think for me, if they're being used as a way to help like describe or clarify a situation, like even I've used the terms like secondary or third throughout our conversation. I think that they can be really useful just in terms of like getting right to the point. But if I was in a relationship with a partner, I wouldn't want the partner to call me like directly to myself in a context where everyone knows what our relationship is. Oh, this is my secondary partner. This is my primary partner. That just doesn't feel like great. Or if you're in a triad, like, oh, this is our third, you know, similarly.
Yeah.
So I think if we're just trying to like cut right to the chase and like describe a dynamic, they're fine. But I wouldn't want that. It just doesn't like, there are other descriptors that would be like much more like loving and sexy.
Yeah, I love that. Loving and sexy. That's a great way. And again, I think it's another situation where talking about it can mean everything, like taking that person's feelings and thoughts into consideration. And my partners and I, we've talked about it before. Sometimes I say, this is my partner and this is my partner. You know? Right. I say, this is my legal husband and this is my non-legal husband or spouse, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, having that conversation, you know?
Yeah. I also wanted to add, again, like for a couple that's opening up and it's like really uncharted territory and it's a little frightening, I think that there can be power in saying, oh, I'm his primary partner. And just being cognizant, like if there is another partner and they have a place in their life, like it's a more established secondary partnership, like bringing everyone to the table and talking about how it feels for everyone. It might feel 100% okay, or they might need to, like share, like, what does it feel like when, you know, partner X calls partner Y his primary partner and his secondary partner? And are there other terms that could be used that would just feel better to everyone or feel okay to everyone?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that's such a great thing to keep underscoring, is just to be open about the conversation and to let everyone have a voice, because it is important just to feel like you're being considered and respected. And people are at different ends of the spectrum, right? There's people who, you know, are more easily offended or more sensitive, and there's nothing wrong with that. So understanding each person's truth, you know, and then there's people that are like, hey, I don't care what you call me as long as you don't call me Shirley or whatever. Right. You know, but understanding that and understanding the nuances and getting to know somebody, it's also part of building that intimacy, because at the end of the day, we all want to feel understood and seen and our feelings to be considered and like we belong, you know. So just having the conversation can mean everything.
Yeah. And again, this is a great example, like rather than having a rule that you'll call me your primary partner, then you're essentially like circumventing a conversation that can like lead to a lot of intimacy and deeper connection and deeper trust.
Yes. I always love this quote that our success in life is partly based on the number of uncomfortable conversations we're willing to have. And sometimes those uncomfortable conversations, we might fear the conversation and walk away from it and think that was a great conversation. You know, so sometimes we build up this anxiety and fear, and it ends up being like this really connecty, beautiful, authentic conversation. You know, so sometimes, you know, it's important just to know that we can create our own suffering and our own fear sometimes.
Yeah.
Another question, and this is a really interesting one. Have you ever been in a don't ask, don't tell dynamic? And if you have, what was that experience like for you, Leah?
Yeah, I recently actually was dating a guy. We both really liked each other. And I that doesn't happen for me super often. And we were just having the best time. And about a month in, again, this is just like, the fact that I'm kind of new to this and I'm like learning the questions that I need to ask early on. And it's like every experience I have like this aha moment. Oh my gosh, you absolutely have to address that like before the first date, because some things are going to be just non-starters for me. But I learned that his wife had asked for a don't ask, don't tell. And I really don't think there was anything shady going on. Like, I think it was completely ethical. I don't think he was trying to deceive me at all. But I had a lot of discomfort about it. And it was funny too, because about a week after I learned about it, we had a scheduling mishap. And I thought we were meeting up on X day, and he totally thought it was on Y day. And both of us had like really good reasons for why. Like we both could see why the other person mistook it the way they did. But he was out with his wife and a bunch of their friends at the time. And I had this aha moment. Okay, this is definitely not going to be our first scheduling mishap. And every time this happens, I'm really going to be like the one who he makes it up to and not the one that he shows up for. And that's just not okay. So that was one kind of aha moment. And then, well, I mentioned, like, I really do think that there was full consent. You can't confirm consent because, like, normally, let's say I'm connecting with someone new and they're married or they're in a partnership. Like, it's important to me to just get like a touch point with my metamor that says, I'm fully on board with this. We do have an open relationship. Just so, so I have that peace of mind that I'm not engaging in something that's not ethical. So don't ask, don't tell, you can't confirm consent. And there's also an implied veto power. You know, like at any moment, the person who asked for the don't ask, don't tell might say like, listen, this really isn't working for me. I mean, especially if they're not talking about it and she has big feelings and they're not talking about it, or he has big feelings. So there is an implied veto power, which I'm super not comfortable with. And then also, like, you end up kind of feeling like this thing that shouldn't be, like this secret that needs to be hidden. And it's just not a good feeling. Like, no one wants to be kept in like the dark or in the shadows. I mean, maybe some people do, but for certain, not me. So, so we ended things and it kind of sucked for both of us. Like, we were both really feeling it, you know?
That's interesting. Yeah. And just like we talked about earlier, there are, I think, people on the spectrums of everything, right? Like the friend I actually was saying earlier who loves to live on her own and have her autonomy and all that. She is aware of open relationships and polyamory, but there are people who actually prefer to cheat, you know, which also means like they prefer to be the mistress or they prefer to be hidden. So, and I'm with you, like where I'm at on that spectrum, obviously, since I run this Living Without Boundaries group, is I'd much rather have everything be open and above board and not be hidden and be acknowledged as a partner. But there are people all along that spectrum. So again, it's just another thing of honoring each person's truth, but also honoring their values. Like, so for me, I value integrity and transparency. So very similar to you, like I would not be okay if I was being, 100% hidden or everything wasn't above board. But getting to that place of self-discovery was a journey for me. It took me a few years to kind of figure that out for myself because, I was kind of testing what was okay and what was not okay and figuring out what my own boundaries were, because we're all evolving, we're all changing, and that's totally okay. And that's what's fun about relationships is watching our partners evolve and change, watching our relationships evolve and change. And I love how that's how we even started our conversation, is realizing that when we open up a relationship, it is inherently changing, right? Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to share about veto power? You already touched on it a little bit.
I think, again, just like going back to the don't ask, don't tell, sometimes you need to experience something in your body before you know if it's okay with you or not. Like you can read all the books, but until you're going through it and you're like, oh, I just have this like heavy feeling, or I just have this like pit in my stomach about this. That was kind of, because initially I'm like, okay, don't ask, because I had just had the experience where I experienced the opposite. It was like the permission granting and I had no privacy and everything was being like shared. And so I remember initially when I heard about the don't ask, don't tell, I was like, oh, this is such a relief. I don't have to go through that anymore, and then I felt it in my body. I'm like, this isn't a good fit for me either.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say, like, allow yourself to have the experiences and really like be in touch with how it feels to you,
Mm-hmm.
and then operate from that place.
Beautiful advice. Beautiful advice. Because I think sometimes when we think about tapping into our intuition, our intuition is here in our head, but it's also in our heart, how we feel, but it's also in our gut, and so our body is sometimes giving us really valuable information. And a lot of times we ignore it, so it's important to pay attention to your feelings, to your physical feelings as well as your emotional feelings, because they can really be gifts that are just so beautiful to us. So I just want to make an announcement here. We've kind of gone through the list of questions that I had to go through. So for those that are watching, there are some people watching right now. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, in the comment box, and Leah and I will do our best to answer those. But in the meantime, Leah, why don't you tell everybody how to find you and how to get in touch with you and learn more about your life and everything that you're passionate about.
Yeah. Before we move on from veto power, I know we touched on it a little bit with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I actually include in my dating profile that I'm not comfortable with dating people who practice veto power. Mm-hmm. I also include that I'm not interested in unicorn experiences either. So I would just say, like, don't be afraid to be really clear and almost like proactive about communicating what's okay and what's not okay with you. Mm-hmm. You're just going to filter out people who are not a good fit. And I would just say to people, veto, it's like having a stranger basically have more say over your relationship than you do. It's a super uncomfortable and like hurtful experience. I mean, I essentially experienced veto power with that first example that I shared, mm-hmm. And you can be just having the most like explosive, elevating, magical connection, and it just ends. So that's definitely not something I'm comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love how you said that you can just be upfront and put it right on your profile. Because at the end of the day, our time is one of our most valuable resources that we have, and we can't manufacture more of it. So I love that idea of filtering people out, because you're also putting your heart on the line. You're spending time with people. So if you can filter out a bad experience or somebody that's not a match, you just maybe saved yourself a ton of time and also a ton of heartache. So mm-hmm. I think that's really great advice.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to touch on that maybe I didn't ask, or anything that's come up through our conversation?
No, I mean, I shared some of the podcasts that I'm really enjoying. Mm-hmm. That's been a great way to learn. Obviously, like, you learn the most from personal experiences, but if you're kind of waiting for the next right personal experience to come along, podcasts can be super valuable. So I shared, or even YouTube channels as well. So I shared some of the ones that are meaningful for me.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of the group. So if any follow-up questions come up and you want to throw them in the comments of the video, I'll try to keep an eye on it and answer as best I can.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds good. Well, I don't see any other comments that came in. So you're in the group. You want me to share your discussion group where we met, or would you like to share that?
Yeah, I can. So I founded and lead a group called the Esther Perel Discussion Group. Mm-hmm. I imagine that a lot of you are familiar with Esther. Like I said, she's kind of like the most like pop cultural preeminent therapist of our time. She's done 2 TED Talks. She's headlined at South by Southwest. She's kind of everywhere. And she's Belgian born. She has just the most poetic use of language. She's so funny. And so like wise and incisive. Her first book was on why desire fades in long-term relationships and how it can be rekindled. And then her second book was on infidelity. Mm-hmm. And so I founded the group 3 years ago. I just love her work. I love talking about it with other people. Mm-hmm. Our community it's called the Esther Perel Discussion Group. It's an extremely safe, open, intellectual, curious, and vulnerable community. Mm-hmm. And we'd love to have you join us if you're interested.
That's awesome. Well, Leah, thank you for your passion. Thank you for your authenticity and the natural research that you do. You can just tell, like, you just, you get a topic and you're like, oh, I'm going to just learn everything I possibly can about that. And then you're also paying it forward. So thank you so much for spending your time here with us today. It's been so fun getting to know you, getting to know that big brain that's on the top of your shoulders there, and your big heart. So thank you so much. And I enjoy continuing to get to know you and being a part of your community and having you here in ours. So you're just so lovely. So thank you again.